That night, the moon was like a silver coin reflecting in the lake. A lake near the forest bank that's mostly still. The gentle breeze dared not to disturb the water. The insects did not call or communicate with each other. They refused to make a noise. For there was a poem being recited against the wind, a strange voice whispering in the night. It sounded soothing in a way, melodic even, but the cold touch in her voice could chill the bone if it wanted to. It was an incredibly beautiful young woman with pale, almost translucent skin sitting on a rock near the lake. She wore a thin white linen dress that looked to cling to her skin like it became part of her own body. She combed her perpetually wet long hair that gave off an aroma of silt and lilies, though her hair with a murky greenish tint matching her eyes seemed to move on its own, dancing by what she recited. However, the waters that night were disturbed. The calmness had been broken by slow, uneven ripples and desperate bubbles traveling towards the surface. Stillness disrupted by the bodies in the lake. That was no ordinary woman lurking nearby. That was a Rusalka. These stories begin during the Green Week or RUSALNA, one of the most dangerous periods in Slavic folklore. This was a time when the restless dead, those who died unnatural or untimely deaths, were believed to wander closer to the world of the living. Among them were the Rusalki, female spirits bound to rivers and lakes, often said to be the souls of women who met violent or tragic ends. They are not mere ghosts. They belong to the water, to the fields, to the trees that lean over the riverbanks. During this week, they leave the waters and move through the forest and meadows, slipping between birch branches and drifting along the edges of fields under the cover of night. In some traditions, their presence brings life to the land. Crops grow stronger where they pass and the earth itself seems to stir with them. However, they were never harmless. Some believed they were a blessing if uninterrupted and a curse if disrespected. Villagers knew to keep their distance. Rivers and lakes were untouched, fields were not disturbed, not out of reverence but out of fear. Cause to cross their path was to invite their attention, and the Rusalki do not forgive attention lightly. When fishermen cast their nets into forbidden waters, and when footsteps returned too soon to the quiet fields, something changed. That's when the bodies began piling up in the lake. The first victim was a traveler in the woods. The night was beautiful, the air fresh and the breeze chilling to some extent. He stopped to rest for a spell until he heard laughter. It sounded like a woman. Soft at first, then echoed louder and louder, traveling in the night, like a stone skipping across water. He called out to her, "Hello, is there anybody there?" Though there wasn't a verbal response, the laughter continued. And so the man followed it. He pursued the laughter like it was a calling of some sort, a hypnotizing summoning if you will. His pursuit had taken him to the lake, where he saw a beautiful pale woman standing ankle-deep in water, her long hair hanging loose and wet. She didn't blink or move, just stared at him. Then she began combing her hair while humming a tune. It sounded more alluring than the laughter that brought him there. He was mesmerized by her beauty, by her voice, and the strange presence that he felt in his soul. Finally, she speaks. "You can come in, you know. The water is lovely tonight." Without hesitation, the man steps forward. It almost seemed like her eyes spoke those words, not her tongue. However, once he entered the lake, the laughter begins again. Slow, soft, and gentle, like a prank being put into place. When the man felt the reeds wrapping around his leg and body, then he began panicking. He tried moving backwards, kicking himself free, but he was stuck in place. The pale woman in the lake disappeared, but the laughter didn't. In fact, it had become louder and more frantic, uncontrolled and sinister. Her voice didn't sound the same. She sounded like her throat had been filled with water. Her laugh sounded more like gargling and choking. He looked around him, fearing for his life, with a sudden realization that he was being dragged deeper and deeper into the lake. Next morning, the villagers found his footprints leading into the water, but none returning. A few nights after, there was a shepherd wandering the same woods. This time, the Rusalka was not in her natural habitat. Instead, the shepherd found a pale woman with translucent skin dancing in the woods. Her feet moved so quickly her body swayed unnaturally, and her long hair, wet and almost tangled, danced with her. Though it did seem strange, her feet didn't seem to touch the ground at all. He noticed that her movements had formed a circle in the woods, but inside the circle, the grass seemed to grow in abundance. He tried to look away, he tried to avoid the gaze from the murky eyes, but he couldn't. She looked so beautiful and her dancing became alluring. With each hand movement or a sway from the hips, the man found himself drawn to the circle. Before he could even think about the consequences, his feet were already touching hers. When or how did he enter the ring, he never knew. His hands were then gently held by the woman, and her smile showed hints of sadness trapped by a facade of seduction. Suddenly, he found himself dancing with her. It didn't feel wrong or out of place, it felt natural. The dance began slow yet rhythmic, and he never knew his feet could move so elegantly. He was holding the woman and her hair smelled of lilies, though her body cold and slightly stiff. The pace then quickened. No matter how fast they moved, the pale woman just looked at him with a death stare. And while the man kept up with the movements, the Rusalka's smile had disappeared entirely. He became tired, his breathing intensified, and his feet were sore. When he tried to pull away or move out the ring, then he felt a sense of panic. The Rusalka's grip on his wrists was so tight that he felt shackles wrapped around them. He felt her fingernails digging into his skin. His body moved with her involuntarily. The dancing never stopped. For hours on end had passed, but to him time was not moving at all. He felt the skin underneath his feet peeling off, and the grassy patch that he thought he stood on was now just soil and stones mixing with his blood. His toes began swelling, his ankles felt sprained, but when he looked at his feet, he saw pieces of flesh dangling about. How long exactly did the torturous dance last will always remain a mystery. Days later, he was found in the woods, his body unmarked and his face twisted in terror, and he had no feet left. You see, the shepherd was danced to death. One night in the week, there was a fisherman near the lake. Despite the warnings from village folk, he chose to ignore it. It was such a beautiful night for fishing, and he was sure to catch enough to sell at the market. His frustration grew with every cast as not a single bite touched his bait. But then a glimmer of hope. He saw movement in the water, not much, just enough to catch his attention. Gentle ripples disturbed the water that came from the end near the bank. So shallow, he says to himself, but that would make them even easier to catch. So he rowed his boat towards the bank, and then he was startled. He saw a woman in the lake. Her head floated above the water, but her arms were to her sides, visible from a steady shoulder position. Her hair long and wet, and her eyes a murky green. The fisherman told her, "Why, I meant to catch a fish, but a beautiful woman like yourself would do as well." And so the Rusalka giggled and swam backwards to the shallow end. But she was quick, swimming at a much faster pace than a human would be capable of doing. The fisherman followed her and moored his boat near the bank. The man removed his clothes ready to jump in, but to his surprise, the woman was directly next to him. She rested her head on her folded arms on the wooden panel of the boat. Well, that saved the fisherman some trouble. Now he didn't have to dive into the cold lake. Then he offered her his hand and she gladly accepted, though he couldn't tell which had been colder, her skin or the water. When she sat in the boat, her white linen dress stuck to her body. The man's eyes traveled to her, taking it all in. However, there was an abnormal amount of water dripping from her hair, like an endless river supply with a current that never seemed to stop. As the boat began sinking, the fisherman became wary. When he cupped his hands, splashing the water back into the lake, the Rusalka grabbed him. She prevented him from draining the water off the boat. Suddenly, like a switch had been flipped in the fisherman's head. He smiled at her, staring deep into her murky green eyes. "You're so beautiful," he says to her, as if the dilemma of a sinking boat was a figment of his imagination. "Of course I am," she replied, her voice soothing and relaxing like a lullaby. The Rusalka held the man's hands with his palms facing her. She gently caressed the skin, following the lines of his palm with her fingernail. The fisherman giggled and recoiled his hand. "Forgive me, I'm rather ticklish," he said. The Rusalka's eyes lit up and widened with amusement. She loved the sound of that. So she pulled him closer towards her, merely an inch or two away from her face. Her fingers traveled under his armpits and the man began laughing uncontrollably. "Stop, stop," he says playfully, and the Rusalka laughs while tickling him. However, as it continued, it became uncomfortable, and the fisherman's voice of restraint and reluctance grew firmer. "Stop," he says angrily, trying not to laugh, but the Rusalka continued. Soon after, the fisherman grabbed her hands to push them away, but it wasn't moving. He felt like they were stone pillars that wouldn't even budge. He used all his might, but the Rusalka never struggled or used effort, once again just looking at him with an expressionless face. Suddenly, his laughter was filled with pain. The Rusalka's fingers moved persistently with precision and vigor. More pressure from her fingernails, more force from the fingertips, and a seductive touch that had now felt ominous. And yet, the fisherman could only laugh. And so, he laughed with a growing chest and a face turning blue. But the Rusalka remained quiet. That cute giggle and her echoing laughter from before had been completely silenced. Her expression was cold, stern, and frightening. He wasn't pushed into the lake, he merely fell inside when the Rusalka released her grip she had on him. He sank to the bottom of the lake with an expression of laughter frozen on his face. For the fisherman was tickled to death. Then there was a couple who decided to take a lakeside stroll. They were in the courting phase, butterflies in their stomach, shyness on their faces, and electric love shocks all over their skin. They were startled when they saw a woman with long dark hair dyed with a hint of green, sitting on a rock, combing her hair and singing. The song sounded like a lullaby, but it was also cold, filled with sadness and pain. The lady told her partner, "We should leave, this isn't a good sign." She whispered it to him, but the Rusalka heard it loud and clear. "And why isn't it a good sign?" she replied. Though the couple never answered. They were petrified. They should have known better than to approach still water at night, especially during the Green Week. But the couple at this point were not known for making good decisions, for their reasoning of being together that night was an unfaithful one. The Rusalka had her back facing the couple, but now she turned towards them. She looked at the man dead in his eyes, her expression stern and cold. "Haven't I seen you before?" she asks. He's nervous, jittery in his speech and body language. Maybe he blurted out, "Respectfully, we do not mean to disturb the water and we shall be on our way." The Rusalka said, "But you have disturbed me." Then the silence was deafening. No sound of water or night insects. No breeze to whistle through or ruffle the leaves. "Show me your hand," the Rusalka demanded. So the man nervously lifted his hand in front, palm facing the water spirit. The Rusalka elegantly entered the water, though she never jumped or dove, more like gently slipped into the lake, traveling towards the man. She noticed the indentation in his ring finger, an indication of something removed. "Are you married?" the Rusalka asked. Then the man and lady looked at each other like they've been caught. They felt ashamed and embarrassed, ridden with guilt. Yes, I am," he replied. However, the man's wife was unaware of his affair, nor of the lady's infidelity. Within a blink of an eye, the Rusalka sank to the bottom, seeming to disappear for the night. The couple sighed in relief until they felt a cold hand behind their heads, respectively. Before they could even speak or move, a force had pushed their faces into the shallow end of the lake. The Rusalka was behind them. They struggled with their gurgled throats and muffled cries for help. When they fought immensely to lift their heads above the water, they saw the Rusalka's reflection on the surface. Not beautiful, not magical, rather ugly and frightening. Her face was wrinkled and distorted, like her skin had been exposed to too much of water for too long. Her hair was now untidy and her eye sockets hollow and bony, like two holes of darkness that brought shame to the abyss. The lady died first, then the man, and their bodies drifted off deeper into the lake. A villager witnessed what happened that night but dared not approach. According to the witness, he said he knew the Rusalka. She was a woman drowned by her husband more than a decade ago. Rumor had it that she caught her husband having an affair, and when threatened to expose him to her family, then he drowned her in the lake that night. She was 20 at the time. Now this story has a rather unexpected ending. In the village, they said no one should walk near the lake during RUSALNA without wormwood. So when the boy's mother tied the bitter stems into a thin garland and placed it around his neck, she did it with shaking hands. "Don't take it off," she told him. "No matter what you hear, no matter what you see or feel." He was impatient, but he nodded. He had heard the warnings all his life. The stories of the Rusalka did not frighten him the way they frightened others. The lake was quiet, serene even. That evening, as the sun dipped and the mist began to gather, he walked the narrow path along the water's edge. The garland brushed lightly against his collarbone, its scent sharp and bitter. For a long time nothing happened. No movement in the reeds, no ripples in the water, only silence. Then a voice, soft and familiar, had echoed through. "Why do you wear that?" He stopped immediately as his heartbeat hastened. The voice came from the lake, but it did not sound distant. It sounded close and gentle. He turned towards the water, his breathing heavy and his body almost stiffened. She stood just at the edge of the water. Her hair hung long and dark, drifting as though the air itself moved through it. With her still pale face, her eyes were fixed on the garland around the boy's neck. "It smells awful," she said softly. The boy swallowed. "It's nothing," he replied. "Ah, but it is not nothing now, is it?" she said. "You don't need it." He never said anything further, but she took a step closer, though the water did not ripple. "Take it off," she whispered. "You'll breathe easier." The boy hesitated, his fingers brushing through the rough stems. The scent was strong, unpleasant, and almost suffocating. "You don't belong to it," she continued. "Why carry something so bitter?" Her voice was calm and reasonable, but also alluring and manipulative. However, behind her, the lake remained perfectly still. The boy loosened the garland slightly, and the relief was immediate. The air felt cleaner, and he didn't feel his entire body being pressed down to the ground anymore. And so the Rusalka smiled. "Much better," she said. He pulled it halfway over his head and then paused. The mist behind the Rusalka thickened, curling inward as if drawn toward her form. The water at her feet darkened, swallowing the faint reflection of the sky. Slowly, the boy lowered the garland back against his chest. He knew that safe feeling that he felt was just an illusion. Mother's words stuck with him throughout his life. The Rusalka's smile faded. "You don't trust me," she said. Now the boy had stepped back with full control over his body. As for the Rusalka, the bitterness returned sharp and grounding. "I was told not to take it off," he said confidently. For a moment she said nothing. Then the lake stirred. A ripple spread outward from her feet, slow and deliberate. Her voice changed. Not louder, just more empty and cold, filled with sorrow and maybe a hint of disappointment. "Then you were told correctly," she whispered. The boy turned and ran, the garland bouncing against his chest, the bitter scent filling his lungs. Behind him the water began to move, not violently but with a quiet persistence, as though something beneath it had begun to follow. However, that night he did not stop running until he reached the village, and once the week had ended, he was the only one who encountered a Rusalka and lived to tell the tale. Wormwood is traditionally a protective herb. The belief wasn't always that it repelled a Rusalka outright, but that it protected the living from harmful spirits, marked a person as guarded or ritually safe, and reduced vulnerability during a dangerous liminal period. So for those who have reached the end and are familiar with a Rusalka, it should be clear that these short stories merges multiple traditions into a single narrative. If there are any other creatures that you would like to see explored, feel free to share them in the comments and I will look into it. Until the next one, do take care.